Hello and welcome back to HEMA Breakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down one of my fights from Clash for the Cash that happened last weekend. And the good news is I did earn some cash, but the bad news is that I lost to people who, frankly, I certainly should have lost to. But in this particular fight, I am going to go over the one that I was probably most proud of, which was my fight against Jieyu. And Jay, as you've probably seen on this channel before, is a really good fighter. You might remember him from a recent video where he beat the person who later went on to win Helsinki Longsword Open. So a very talented fencer in his own right. And one that's very interesting because he is also a very patient and defensive fighter like me. So the resulting fight was pretty interesting as we both tried to get in and around each other's offense and see what would work and what would not work. So, starting off with our first exchange, we have a couple of disclaimers. One, the flashing is not anything I can do about. We had this tournament in a very old school with some very old fluorescent lights, and it's only going to get worse as we hit the slow-mo. Sorry. Two, I am on the left and my opponent is on the right. Hopefully at this point you can recognize me, but, maybe that's just me. And three, by the time you get to the end of this exchange, my body completely obscures the action. So there's not going to be much talk in this particular segment about what actually happens at the end of the exchange, but what I'm instead going to talk about is the footwork. Now, I fence with my left leg forward now, despite the fact that I'm right-handed, but Jieyu fights with his right leg forward. Now, this particular interaction is going to happen a lot if you're the kind of person who fences with their left leg forward, regardless of whether you're left or right-handed. But in my opinion, this is a very interesting interaction when both people are right-handed because it comes down to a discussion and an understanding of footwork and initiating actions. Part of the reason that everybody loves to fight with their right leg and their right hand forward is because it kind of puts everything into a nice, neat, orderly line. It gets your cross guard right out in front of your leg and of your hands and of your dominant side shoulder, and it pulls your non-dominant side back so that it's not as viable of a target. This makes things very convenient and easy for defensive actions, and it also means that when you're going to throw a cut or a thrust, you can kind of throw them in a direct line straight out from your shoulder and know that you're probably going to reach your target. However, in order to use forward momentum, you either have to take a simple step forward or a lunge. Doing a passing step, of course, would result in your left leg being forward and everything being kind of screwed up. But if you start with your left leg forward, well, you have some of these same disadvantages. You are more square with your torso, which means both sides of your body are a viable target. And most importantly, that you have to do a huge amount of travel to either side of your body in order to protect those sides. So on the face, it seems like having your left leg forward is actually a pretty distinct disadvantage. But there is one important thing, and that is with the simple steps and the lunges. In order to make a attack, someone with their right leg forward has to do these smaller, more explosive Olympic fencing style attacks, and that's not necessarily a bad thing or a weak thing. But when you have your left leg forward, the big attacks that you can throw come with a passing step with your dominant leg. And this is a very important thing to consider because one, passing steps are always going to be larger and more distance covering than a simple step, and sometimes even a lunge. But more importantly, the end position that you end up in when you take a passing step is significantly more advantageous than a deep lunge. A deep lunge is hard to get out of, and a simple step or a passing step is a lot easier to get out of. More importantly, too, is that when you use your initiating tack to take a big passing step with your dominant leg, you end up in that right leg forward position, but after you have already closed the distance with your initial attack. And if it didn't land, you find that you're now in an appropriate kind of defensive position to maybe throw some follow-up counter strikes or attacks from. In my opinion, having your left leg forward and using a passing step with your right leg as your initiating action is a really great way to try to bridge the gap between the explosive, high-intensity but defensively minded Olympic fencing style footwork with the right leg forward, but simultaneously giving yourself an advantage in your ability to chase down people who use that kind of footwork. Now for our next significantly more visible and interesting exchange, we have a classic countersvaric. Now one thing I want to point out here is Jieyu's footwork again. Now, as I mentioned earlier, part of the problem or advantage of having your right leg forward is that you have to use simple steps and lunges to kind of throw all of your techniques. And you can see that kind of setup footwork from Jieyu here. He comes in, he throws a little hand strike, or what looked like it was supposed to be a hand strike that I parry, but he does so with a simple step, at which point he asserts his point and takes his big passing step. Now, as he throws his big passing step, he is of course trying to drive in a thrust. And the reason this is a good idea is that the initiating action that he threw, that little hand strike, was probably actually supposed to be a beat attack, one in which he tries to beat my blade out of the center line and then reasserts that center line that he just removed me from with that big thrust. A really nice, clean, 1, 2, 3 setup there. However, in this particular case, I am able to parry the setup cut and then crump the thrust off to my left side, at which case I come all the way around from my bottom left to my bottom right and throw a counter right Zverkow. Now, the reason this can work is primarily because of two particular things. One, if you watch my footwork, you'll notice that I kind of take a simple step back to match the simple step of my opponent, but then when they take a big passing step, I do not take a big passing step. And this difference in distance is a clear indicator of why the result was the way that it was. Because Jieyu had to take a passing step with his back left leg, he ended up with his left leg forward, and my left leg forward stayed forward, which means that as I threw my right Zverk, I was attacking the left side of my opponent. As such, since he had just been crumped off to the side, Jieyu tried to throw a left Zverk of his own to counter my right Zverk. And the reason that I managed to land first and was able to cover afterwards is because that big left passing step meant that he had to basically race his own body to the target. My target was coming directly at me, and it was coming directly at where my blade was going to be, so I got there faster. At the exact same time, Jieyu had to take his blade all the way around to the other side of his body and race the fact that that was the side of his body that was going the most forward, meaning that he had to get his blade into presence before his foot landed, which isn't really possible when you were the one who got parried by the thrust in the first place. So we see a little bit of an application of the footwork that has been set up in the previous exchange. Now, this next exchange is a really long one, and one that results in no points being awarded to either fighter, but still a very important one that showcases what each of us were trying to do in order to get ahead of our opponent. Now, previously, what has been happening here is that Jieyu has been using hand snipes and beat attacks to try to set up his forward momentum, at which point he's going to try to read whatever kind of counter or counter riposte that I'm trying to throw, and then tries to kind of work around that. And in the previous exchange, I managed to get the better of a thrust and throw a counter Zverk. But this time, you see Jieyu throwing these kinds of hand snipes over and over again, but you're seeing me overreact by going backwards a little too far and a little too intensely, waiting for those attacks to come in, and more importantly, waiting for those follow-ups to come in even harder. As a result, Jieyu is doing a really good job of gaming me and trying to figure out what my footwork patterns are going to be. He is constantly moving forward, tapping my blade, looking at my reaction, and getting me to overreact. And then, suddenly, towards the end, he finally gets me to overreact, and he tries to capitalize on this situation. However, while he was doing these timing attacks, I was also trying to get into the timing of my opponent, Jieyu. And when he throws this final attack, which clearly meant to be a similar sort of setup to the kinds of things he was throwing the entire exchange, I instead throw a big right Zverkow towards his head. Now, what I was trying to do was I was trying to game the idea of them. Whenever Jieyu came forward, he would throw a little hand shot. And the idea was that if I threw a big right Zverkow, I would simultaneously move my hands up, which would make them a little bit harder to hit, but frankly also mean that if he had struck me on the hands, I would hopefully be able to strike him in the head in the afterblow, or maybe even first, and give myself a 2-point to 1-point swing, which of course is a pretty important thing to go for every once in a while. However, Jieyu recognizes what is happening as soon as he starts to come forward, and instead of going for the hand shot that I think he was going to go for, he instead throws a little bit of a parry. Now, because I threw what was attempting to be an interrupting right Zverkow from cold open, I get parried, and then I find out that actually I am in the very compromised position because my hands are now very high, but I am not close to my opponent, meaning that the follow-up that Jieyu throws is a nice little middle howl towards the upper side of my right arm, which looks like from the footage, it makes a little bit of contact along with my sword. Now, again, at the beginning, I said that this resulted in no points for everybody, but this was a really, really smart move from Jieyu, and it shows that despite the fact that we were both kind of doing the same thing over and over again throughout the entire exchange, when it came to the actual clash that happened at the end, we both already had an idea of what we were going to do to try to counter each other, and both of us actually had a pretty decent chance at landing it. So for our next exchange, we have another adaptation, and this time it is my adaptation to make. Now, one thing you might have noticed while we were talking about some of these other exchanges is that Jieyu's beat attacks are really meant to try to stifle the guard that I am standing in. This guard that I am standing in is, of course, called Spreck Fencer, and it's basically just a long point, but with your left leg forward, that kind of just sits over the right side of your body. There's nothing really to write home about as far as this guard is concerned, but one thing to pay attention to is the fact that it is very point forward threatening, meaning that what I'm essentially trying to tell my opponent is, if you charge at me, I'm just going to push my sword a little bit further forward, and you're going to run right into that tip unless you do something about it. And the idea here is that previously Jieyu has been using these beat attacks and these hand shots in order to pull me out of this guard, or at least take away the threat of my point. And that's a very good idea to do. However, the counter to this situation is to do exactly what I do here, which is to wait for your opponent to try to tap your blade and utilize that opportunity to duck under their attack, their beat attack, and then thrust them on the offside. So again, I am right-handed and I am standing in a right side guard despite the fact that my left leg is forward, which means that as Jieyu tries to cross the line from his right to his left to try to beat my blade, he's going to end up on the left side of his body. So I duck from the left side or the right side of my body to the left side of my body and attempt to stab my opponent right up there in the right side of the shoulder. Now, in this particular case, I do not get my point quite to the level that maybe I would have preferred. It looks like I actually catch just a little bit of the mask on the side, but it's rather dramatic looking because I turn the mask a bit and then I overrun my opponent, going past them and throwing a little bit of a follow-up just in case the judges didn't think my thrust was any good. But what's important to point out here is that you can see that as I start to initiate my thrust, I immediately duck under, and you can see that the pre-programmed defensive cut that Jieyu had that he was going to go for in his mind ends up flailing all the way off into a little bit of nowhere land onto his left side, making him completely open on his right side, which is exactly where I at least mostly attempt to thrust. It ends up kind of going across to the other side of the body again, because I guess my point control just wasn't really on point in that exchange. But it ends up working out for me. I get the nice thrust, and then we move on to another set of exchanges. Now, this next exchange is a simple one and a short one, but it shows that the pressure that Jieyu has been putting on me is finally starting to pay off. As I have pointed out before, Jieyu has been pressuring me, coming forward and throwing these shots at my hands. And the pressure is definitely getting to me. Now that he realizes that he can't necessarily be throwing these kinds of beat attacks at my blade because of what happened last time, he is instead throwing them just directly at my hands and using his pressure and his distance and his timing to make sure that, as it happens in this exchange, I throw a hand shot that just hits nothing but air, and then he closes the gap the rest of the way and throws a hand shot that managed to hit me before I am able to back up fast enough and get away. And despite the fact that, again, it's very quick and very simple, this shows that Jieyu is still paying attention to the kinds of reactions that he was getting out of me in some of the earlier exchanges, and he is still ready to capitalize on them. If I am going to continue to sprint backwards and try to throw some flailing hand strikes as a get away from me style tactic, Jieyu is going to continue to capitalize on them. He's going to continue to apply that pressure, and he's going to stifle all of my offense with offense of his own. Now, this next exchange is another short one and another rather simple hand shot on the side of Jieyu, but another pretty important interaction as far as displaying what each of us are trying to do, namely me in this exchange. Now, something I talked about earlier was whenever someone comes in and they tap your sword and then they move backwards, there is a very obvious opportunity there where if you can time when they're going to go forward and then when they're going to go backwards, there's an opportunity to strike. And that's the exact kind of opportunity that I'm attempting to capitalize on. I notice that Jieyu is coming forward, tapping my blade, and then either standing there or moving backwards. And so what I do is I wait for Jieyu to come forward, tap my blade, I just let him do it, and then the second he starts to move backwards, I attempt to explode forward with my own Shielhao to try to close that distance with my passing step, hoping that he throws a simple step of his own, and then basically chase him down and stab him in the chest, or at the very least get an interaction where I have the advantage because I have all the forward momentum and I've overwhelmed my opponent's backward momentum. But that's not what happens here. And the reason it doesn't happen is because Jieyu has been making very careful adjustments to his distance and the timing the entire time that I have been trying to capitalize on that distance and timing. So what happens here is I throw my Shielhao exactly when I think my opponent is going backwards. I take my big step forward and I'm just not fast enough and I don't go far enough forward. At which point Jieyu is able to back up faster than I am able to go forward, and then he throws a very nice follow-up hand strike to my hands. One that's very easy to land because the Shielhao, of course, results in me putting my hands all the way out there as far as I can and turning my crossguard to a horizontal position, a vertical position, which means that I don't have anything to really defend my hands with. So a really great execution by Jieyu, and another great understanding of that the distance and the timing on these kinds of reactions is so tight that if I don't get it right, well, Jieyu is going to get it right, and he's going to be able to punish these failed executions. So this next exchange is actually probably my favorite of the entire fight, and because it is one that I get a point on, but also one where we both, myself and my opponent, showcase both of the setups and payoffs that we are both trying to get to work this entire fight. Now, one thing that you've seen me try a couple times now and fail a couple times on is to try to time whenever my opponent, Jieyu, is coming forward and then backwards in an attempt to try to overwhelm his backward momentum with a big attack. At the exact same time, Jieyu has been trying to bait these big attacks out of me so that he can snipe me on the hands, and he has been very successful in doing so. So in this next exchange, we basically see every single one of the tactics we've seen up till now deployed, but only one of which ends up being successful. So the first is Jieyu comes in, taps my blade, and then, seeing that I am going to be going backwards, follows it up with a big lunge and a big hand cut. Now, the only reason I get out of the way of this one is actually because I was so defensive and so squirrely that I jumped back far enough to be able to parry this. There is entirely a version of reality where I try to parry that little baited hand strike, and then as I try to parry the follow-up strike, he can get close enough to either hit me in the bottom of the elbow or maybe even the leg, and I would not have been able to parry that. But that is not what ends up happening. However, as soon as I recognize that I have managed to parry both of these attacks, I see an opportunity, and I begin my big passing step, which up till now has always come with a big attack. Only this time, I feint it a little bit. Rather than throwing any real attack, I simply throw my giant passing step, and I just kind of come up into a cron position. And that ends up being the right choice, because as soon as I take my big passing step, it turns out Jieyu was waiting for it. And as soon as he sees that big passing step, he throws a big get away from me hand cut. Now, if I had thrown the kind of Shielhao or a Scheitelhao that I have thrown in the past with this big passing step, I have no doubt that I probably would have been hit in the hand again, as we have seen previously. But that was not the decision I made, and because I went to that neutral cron position, I was able to parry another strike as I am closing the distance. But at this point, Jieyu is in a very compromised position. He has just sent all of his momentum backward as fast as he can, and he has thrown a very large, very committed get away from me strike towards where he thought my hands were going to be, but it got parried. And now I have another opportunity. So I take another big passing step, and this time I feint again. Now this utilizes a concept that actually exists in a lot of martial arts, which is every single time you parry on one side of your body or block on one side of your body, the natural human reaction is to then throw a follow-up attack on the opposite side. It's that left-right mentality that you can see everywhere, from boxing to Muay Thai to even sword fighting. And it is a very natural reaction because it just makes the most kind of sense to the human body. If you're sending momentum in one direction and you felt some kind of stoppage because you blocked, it makes sense to then reverse that and go to the other side. Similarly, it's hard to parry on one side of your body and then race to the other side. Going in this left-right format is often the way that people end up on the short end of the stick and ended up getting hit because they just weren't fast enough. But that is not what I throw. Instead, after I have parried an attack that kind of landed on the right side of my body, I then throw a big leaping right Zverk, which of course is on the exact same side that the guard just had happened. Which means that Jieyu, who is now backing up and in a little bit of a sticky situation, instinctively throws a parry to the opposite side. And you can see this happen in the slow motion, where I'm coming forward with the big right Zverkow. Jieyu is on the left side of his body, where the Zverkow is going to come in at, but because he is so used to that left-right style of fencing that, again, anyone would be used to because it's so common, he immediately tries to parry the right side of his body where I am not. And I get a clean little Zverkow right to the top of the arm. Now, at which point we both kind of careen out of the ring because both of us had just a ton of forward and backward momentum. And then I throw a cheeky little follow-up just to make 100% sure that I get the call. But the real cool thing about this is that we can see from each of the executions of each of the techniques that it is really the culmination of everything that we are both trying to pull off. And while I happen to be the one to get the point, there were many instances along the way where Jieyu could have easily baited me into doing something I wasn't supposed to or shouldn't have and gotten away with the point himself. It's a really great exchange. It's a really great demonstration of good feedback loop and loop-based fencing, and most importantly, a great example that just because you have made an adaptation to somebody doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to throw it, even in these little instances where things aren't necessarily going the way that you want. Jieyu threw plenty of his own adaptations in this exchange that, again, could have easily resulted in the win for him, and if it had, it would have been just as amazing as what ended up happening in reality. Now, this is going to be the last exchange, and there's another new adaptation here that really comes down to a little bit of the context of the fight itself, but also another little adaptation to the kinds of probing strikes that Jieyu had been throwing against me. So what happens here is that I'm coming forward with some pressure, but I'm trying with my simple steps. I'm trying to pressure with my smaller, more precise footwork because I don't want to take my big passing step and end up getting punished in the hands by overextending. But in the process of doing my tiny little footwork, I end up pushing Jieyu all the way to the corner of the ring. Now, previously, I had gotten him close to the corner or close to the edge of the ring, but never really quite as quickly as I did in this particular instance. And the technique I utilize here is one that really only works in this particular kind of situation. So what happens here is Jieyu comes forward, throws a little bit of another one of these probing hand strikes or these beat attacks, attempting to get me to open up, but I stand completely still. Now, the reason this is important is because A, if he had gone for one of his fully committed tricky little hand shots or maybe even a leg shot, he actually probably would have landed it. But I had already kind of forced him into the back of the corner, and I had clearly gotten him into a bit more of a defensive mindset. But that defensive mindset ends up being the bane of the existence here, because what happens is after Jieyu kind of resets and goes back to his safe little corner, he recognizes that he's about to be pushed out of the ring by my forward pressure, or at the very least my lack of backward pressure. So he attempts to take a big step back, recognize that, oh wait, I can't keep making these, and I'm going to move a little bit farther forward. That is the trigger that I was looking for the whole time. And what happens is the second I see Jieyu start to even move forward, I immediately crump his blade off to my left side and throw a right Zverkow. And the reason this can work is because I'm taking advantage of the fact that every time Jieyu backs up, he then has to return a little bit to a more neutral position in order to stay out of the edge of the ring, in order to keep himself from being wrung out. And because I know he's going to make that little forward bit of momentum without any kind of pressure or attack, I can simply take a step forward of my own, crump the blade, and make sure that what happens after there is always going to be advantageous for me. Because the two options here is once your blade gets crumped, you take a big step backwards and end up out of the ring, or you stand your ground or even move forward and get hit with that left Zverk anyway. Because the thing about the crump how is that it sends your blade into a really, really bad position. It sends both of our blades into a really, really bad position. But the thing is that once I crump my opponent's blade over to my bottom left quadrant, I now have the pre-programmed response of throwing that same counter right Zverk, and I know, based on the fact that he either has to take a big step backwards or stand his ground, that his left shoulder is still going to be an ideal target. Because if he takes a big step backwards, that left shoulder is going to be forward. If he takes a big step forward, that left shoulder is going to be forward. And if he manages to just stand his ground, it's still going to be exactly where I want it to be. And it's going to be really, really hard to get his blade all the way over from the bottom right to his top left and to defend his opening. So I get another nice, clean little right Zwerchhau to the arm. And actually, at the time of this exchange, it was tied 6-6, but we didn't know that we were actually running out of time. So what ends up happening here is that this exchange ends, and then the table says, actually, you ran out of time during that exchange. That's it. The fight is over, and I got the win. A little bit of a disappointing end because neither of us knew that we were going into the final exchange here when we actually did so, and probably would have had some different tactics. But it is still a very interesting exchange with some really cool adaptations, and it's a really cool fight that I'm particularly proud of. If maybe because I then got my ass beat by two really great fencers immediately after this. But either way, it was a cool fight. If you want to see more of this, I'm going to try to show some more Clash footage, though obviously I'm going to try to do my best to try to tamper down on some of the flickering, but there's not much you can do when old fluorescent lights and high shutter speed interact. So I will see you back here on Thursday with another fight.